Welcome to Oh God, What Now? I'm Dorian Lynskey, and I'm still high on politics. On today's show, Prime Minister Keir Starmer, which is a lovely phrase, is in Washington, D.C. for a summit to mark the 75th anniversary of NATO. It was Labour's Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin who co-founded NATO. How do Starmer and Foreign Secretary David Lammy see the UK's role in the world? Plus, the Lib Dem strategic genius, Labour's peculiar losses, a sea change in Scotland, and Reform's overrated performance. We unpack some of the election trends you might have missed. And in the extra bit for supporters, the panel look back on the election nights they love to remember and some they have tried to forget. Let's meet today's panel. First, it's Westminster editor for The Lead, Zoe Grünewald. Hi, Zoe.
Hello.
Reform UK were accused of literally fabricating AI candidates. Now they've admitted that some of them are actual human beings, but many did not campaign or turn up for the count. And obviously there's a significant legal difference because, I believe you could go to jail for inventing candidates. But is there a substantial difference between paper candidates and non-existent ones?
So you're right that paper candidates aren't particularly uncommon. We know that a lot of parties have paper candidates, which are essentially candidates who are there and are real, but don't really expect to win, so don't really turn up. But this seems to be a little bit different. So there have been several high-profile democracy campaigners who have called for an investigation by the Electoral Commission into this. Parliamentary candidates are not required to show identification when applying to stand for election. But obviously we are when we go and vote at the ballot box. So it seems that there is a sort of slight discrepancy there and a slight unfairness. It's something that the Electoral Commission just has to take for your word. You take you at your word when applicants apply, so to be electoral candidates. So that's really interesting. The reason why Reform UK would be very, very keen to stand candidates in every seat, even ones where they're not sure they're going to win, is in part political, in part to make it difficult for the Tories and to sort of shore up their presence as a legitimate political party, but also because parties receive money for every 200 votes they gain per candidate. So they receive something called short money, which is about £42.82. It's not a lot. And there's also spending limits are also they increase for parties based on the number of candidates they have. So they're entitled to spend £11,319 per candidate standing, plus 8 to 12 pence per registered parliamentary elected, depending on the type of constituency. So there are financial incentives, essentially, for Reform to fill candidates as well.
I mean, it just seems to me that, I don't know whether they could just make it stricter. I mean, they do have to have their addresses, right? So presumably people can find out if these people live at these addresses, but it seems to me they could be a bit stricter about ID and just making them show up for the count. I thought it was outrageous that George Galloway did not turn up to lose in Rochdale, thus depriving me of a pleasure. And it just seems to me like this is quite basic. That if you are going to stand as an MP, and in George Galloway's case, is an actual MP, the idea that you can just go, I'm just not going to bother. I could do that. I could be a paper candidate who didn't campaign and didn't turn up anywhere. If I could do it, that seems like it's quite bad.
Yes, I completely agree. It's not fair on constituents who are given a choice, but that choice isn't really a legitimate choice. And absolutely, you think every candidate should at least turn up for the count. I know in the case of one of the Reform candidates, they said they were in hospital with pneumonia during the count. But that doesn't account for the fact that they didn't turn up to any hustings, they didn't campaign, there was no evidence about them online, there was no evidence about their campaign, there was just a very reformy Twitter account attached to them. They have been proved to be real, and there was an AI-enhanced image that was going around, and it seemed that the enhancement was on their hairline and possibly on their weight as well. So they did exist, but it was... the image was definitely doctored.
I would definitely do that if they AI enhanced my hairline. That would be a real incentive to run. And we have Guardian columnist and author Rafael Behr. Hi, Raf.
Hi, Dorian.
Suella Braverman, you'll have noticed, went nuclear in America with a speech of apocalyptic bigotry. For those that don't know, she claimed that the Progress Pride flag flew over government buildings like occupied territory and said she was physically repulsed by clinicians at the Tavistock Gender Care Clinic who she called monsters seeking to mutilate children. Even critics of the Tavistock were shocked by that, and Kemi Badenoch told the Conservative shadow cabinet, another lovely phrase, that Braverman was having a very public nervous breakdown. Now, we're going to have months, I think, to talk about the next Tory leader, but do you think it's safe to say that Braverman has gone too far too soon?
She's definitely misread the room, or rather specifically, she misread the room that she wasn't in because she was speaking from the US. And in that particular room, if you've got a kind of a radical conservative audience, the stuff that she was saying is closer to the mainstream, or at least it probably doesn't sound sort of unhinged. And what's interesting in this case is it's not clear to me whether in Braverman's case she whether there's a sort of a method to it and there's a sort of a tactical awareness that it makes sense to occupy the most extreme fringe position that could be available to a Tory because she's got an eye on what the future sort of mutation of Torydom, so it intersects with reform is, or whether she's even sort of keeping open the option of defecting to reform and becoming a bit of a Farageist, or whether she's just actually really stupid and hasn't fully understood or taken on board some of the things that she would need to know, not just in terms of what the country was saying, because actually, although it's easy to sort of point and laugh at Tory MPs saying things now that feel almost immediately culturally obsolete because so much of the electorate has rejected the Tories, we have to remember that although they feel they ought to care about that, just in terms of the selection of the next leader and the next few months and even years, that's actually less important for a lot of these people. I mean, they are pitching to the selectorate, the bit of the country that is actually still Tory and still cares about who the next Tory leader is. So from that point of view, it's still interestingly a misreading of the room, because actually a lot of Tory MPs have sat there quietly thinking we've gone a bit mad, maybe we should be less mad in the last couple of months. But whether there's some tactical reason for her to think that doesn't matter, my people want me to be saying this stuff, is less clear. But she definitely over-egged it, because actually quite right-wing Tories have been recoiling from it.
I mean, I've never heard anyone say something like that, like apart from just some mad blue tick on Twitter. Monsters seeking to mutilate children is further out than anything I've ever read.
But and within the idiom of the radical American right wing of politics, though. I mean, it's so this is a climate in which, I mean, remember when Liz Truss was sort of courting radical American conservatism? She was rubbing shoulders with Steve Bannon in a room where Tommy Robinson was considered a sort of a hero of radical right wing politics, and not just a fascist. And so it's very, I mean, I agree with you entirely. It's just the most extraordinary kind of congealing of a sort of a foul substance that was at least sort of kept vaguely fresh within the idiom of British politics. It's now sort of soured and curdled. But I don't know whether, as I say, whether in Braverman's case, this is who she really is, and she's just given up pretending to be anything else, and whether that's actually possibly even worse, she isn't even really that person still, but she just feels for some reason it's in her interest to perform that role.
Tim Montgomery was insisting that she's quite nice in person, which in a way makes it worse.
Yeah, that's not uncommon. I mean, people with absolutely appalling opinions can still have manners.
Let's begin. Keir Starmer introduced himself to the world when he attended this week's NATO summit in Washington, D.C. It was an opportunity for Starmer to lay out a new vision for foreign policy and national security with his new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. Lammy has described his doctrine as progressive realism, and he wrote an article in Foreign Affairs laying out what it is. What does that actually mean?
Well, it's a very good question, isn't it? I mean, I suppose the first test is you think is anyone promoting the opposite? So what would the opposite be? Regressive fantasy, regressive unrealism? And at first you think, well, that sort of thing. And you think, well, actually, no, that has literally been conservative foreign policy for the last 5 or 6 years. So actually, yes, I mean, he's right to say being progressive and realistic are, you combine them and you have a new foreign policy doctrine for the UK. But where it gets a little bit more complicated is, how does it work as a lens applied to very specific problems? So that what he's trying to do here, obviously, is capture a little bit of the moral imperative that Robin Cook brought to the new Labour government in 1997 when he said Britain was going to have an ethical foreign policy, and that people applauded it, and it felt like a breath of fresh air at the time. And then quite quickly, even before the Iraq War, where the idea of ethical foreign policy unraveled spectacularly, but even before that, the fact is, running any country's foreign policy, you've got to deal with countries with unsavory regimes, you've got to make hard tactical choices. Realpolitik just interferes. And so I think what David Lammy's sort of the generous interpretation of what he's saying is, can we retain a moral compass with our progressive centre-left values, but also just understand that realpolitik is a factor? And then where it becomes awkward is if you say, okay, well, then let's pluck a difficult foreign policy choice, from the menu and see what the progressive realist answer to it would be. And so like a big one, say China. And is that just an enemy and you don't want them anywhere near your country and your economy, and you take part in a new Cold War because it's a authoritarian dictatorship run by the Chinese Communist Party? Or do you try and be open and trade and forget the fact that it's an awful dictatorship because they've got lots of money and you want to do commerce with them? And guess what? The answer is a bit of both. You kind of want to recognize that China's a difficult partner and sometimes a threat, but also has a big role in the UK economy, and you can't just lock them out. So, well, you've just described the dilemma. You haven't given a prescription for navigating it. So I'm not persuaded there's a whole lot there. But as I say, compared to what the Tories have been doing, progressive and realistic, that's a welcome change.
Yeah, I'm worried that it just might be nice to authoritarians, but feel bad about it afterwards.
I think that is an awful lot of what foreign policy is going to look like. Well, and has been. I mean, it's the Cold War is, I think, is an environment that we're going to have to start studying again, because it will feel very familiar that, you have these sorts of macro challenges, which is, for example, the Kremlin and Russian policy towards Eastern Europe and recruiting other fellow traveller regimes around the world. And how do you balance out that influence? Well, is it with marginally less bad regimes? If you're looking, if you're looking to deal with diplomacy in the Middle East, well, and the problems of Israel and Gaza, well, you don't like Netanyahu's government, you don't like Hamas, you don't like the Iranian regime, you don't much like the Saudis, right? So who are you dealing with where to get a solution to this? Clearly, you're in the realm of holding your nose for a lot of what constitutes realistic foreign policy in an incredibly volatile time. And then you've got the question of Donald Trump. I mean, it remains true that you have to deal with the office of the American president, and there are all sorts of strategic reasons why, for the medium to long term, the UK is still going to be locked into a very, very important relationship with all of the instruments of American foreign policy. But Trump is a tyrant, and he might well be the next president. And there, unfortunately, it's a cliche, but there really are no nice, simple, clean moral lines in this stuff.
Zoe, as we'll discuss, the Gaza issue cost Labour hundreds of thousands of votes and a handful of seats. Now, the party wants a permanent ceasefire and recognition of a Palestinian state and an ultimate solution. What can it do to sway Netanyahu? It's obviously there is a political and sort of moral imperative to do something, because their position is moved quite a lot from that awful, LBC interview early on that caused so much damage. But what levers do Starmer and Lammy have?
Well, I think when you look at the sort of influence we can have compared to a state like America, just in terms of how much money, we pump into Israel, or even just our position in the world, clearly we have far less power. So we probably won't be able to force Netanyahu to agree to a ceasefire. And, even if we did stop the armed exports to Israel, that would be a very small proportion of arms that's actually affected, and would probably have very little difference. But we do have a degree of soft power. I mean, the UK might not be as influential as it was many years ago, but we do still have some standing. And, we are in many ways an ally to Israel in a environment where they are kind of surrounded by lots of countries that aren't so favourable to them. So yes, we can, also we can talk with other countries, we can talk with Europe, we can talk with the US about our approach. There is that sort of soft diplomacy that we have. But I think mainly, and especially for Starmer, it's about, as you say, principle and moral imperative. And I think, from a sort of domestic political perspective, the main thing for Starmer will be trying to get back trust that is lost with those communities by showing that Labour's principle to this, or Labour's attitude to this, is that we are in favour of a ceasefire, and we are in favour of Palestinian statehood, and we favour a two-state solution. And Labour and a Labour government will be pushing for that as much as we can. But let's not pretend that we have that power solely in our grasp.
Yeah, I think it's going to be incredibly difficult for Labour on that particular issue, just because, exactly as Zoe was saying, when you drill into what would be this actual policy response that a Labour government could bring to this question that might satisfy some of the people who have been, understandably so animated by it that is the single one thing that drives their voter choice. And it turns out that because there's going to be some awkward, murky compromise there, or you have to sort of bring some realpolitik to it, the space of what Starmer could do or say that would sort of get you that more satisfying moral click for a particular audience that really wants to feel essentially not just the kind of let's have a two-state solution, let's have peace in the Middle East, let's have a ceasefire, but actually often what actually amounts to a virulently anti-Israel position. You'd be talking about sort of boycotts and sanctions, and it's not just necessarily a two-state solution. In some cases, it's a kind of anti-Zionist rhetoric that essentially crosses the line into let's just sort of eradicate Israel altogether. And although that might not be the mainstream position for a lot of people, that's some of the sort of rhetoric that really has a purchase in that argument. And there's no way any UK Prime Minister is ever going to say that stuff. So I think actually in terms of what will satisfy the most animated audience on this stuff, there isn't actually a whole lot of realistic policy area that Starmer can actually expand into.
Raf, this wasn't Lammy's first choice of brief. And I remember he came on Romaniacs years ago. And back then, you'd have sort of seen him in the Home Office, in Justice, maybe. Those were the issues he was concerned with. But he has made good contacts abroad. He's friendly with Barack Obama they both went to Harvard Law School. And he's sort of credited with playing a blinder at D-Day when Sunak was unaccountably absent and getting Starmer to meet Lynskey and so on. Do you think that he has proven himself in opposition as the right man for the job, as somebody with some kind of, with some of those skills? Like you said, maybe the doctrine is yet to be proven, but at least with the skills of diplomacy and so on.
Well, I think the answer to that is the fact that he is doing the job and has made the transition quite smoothly from shadow foreign secretary to foreign secretary. There was a little bit of speculation and had been for a while. I saw it finally sort of bubble up out into the open just before the election as to whether actually he might suddenly be bounced out of that role at the last minute, because you had, for example, Douglas Alexander, a former Secretary of State, coming back into the Labour Parliamentary Party, who might quite fancy a big foreign policy job like that, or somehow make ideas like put David Miliband in the Lords and make him foreign secretary. I mean, none of that stuff was going anywhere, and it was all just sort of chatter.
David Miliband fandom is alive and well.
And but the reality is, Keir Starmer, it's pretty clear from people who've worked with him and observing him that. And from the appointments he's made, actually, some of them quite surprising since taking power, that what he really wants is people who he can trust to do the job and who have proved that they have some kind of expertise and some competence in that field. And very clearly, he thinks David Lammy meets that threshold. And you mentioned the case of, the D-Day celebration where Rishi Sunak dropped the ball, went home, vacancy. The right levers were pulled and calls made that meant Starmer was there ready to appear, and they got the photo of him and Lynskey in the manifesto. And my understanding is that when Lammy and his team claim a bit of credit for that and pulling that off, that is true. It's their contacts. That he has done enough of the groundwork to look like the diplomat in chief for the new Starmer operation, and that's the job of foreign secretary. The one sort of addendum to that, I would say, is it's worth bearing in mind also that Nick Thomas Symonds has this special cabinet office job, which is relations with the EU, and it'll be interesting to see whether that's just a sort of thing that seems like a very clever distinction and division of Labour, until you realise actually there's going to be all kinds of competition and some potential friction there. So I don't quite know what that means as to whether or not Lammy is in charge of the whole, what is the UK's post-Brexit EU policy going to be, when there seems to be quite an important person in the cabinet office who also has that job.
Zoe, the Tories don't have many attack lines right now, bless them, but one is Labour's refusal so far to match Sunak's precise commitment of 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2030. But you've got fears of Putin going beyond Ukraine if he wins the war, NATO skeptic Trump becoming president again. I mean, is this a kind of, is this almost like, is this a kind of pointless attack at this point? Because Labour's going to have to step up on defence, and arguing about 2.5 right now is sort of irrelevant because not spending more on defence is not an option.
So the Prime Minister has said today it's a cast iron commitment to increase defence spending from 2.3% to 2.5%.
Oh, he said that today. Okay.
He did, but I mean, they've said that. They've said that the whole time. But the point is, he hasn't given a timeline, really. And again, it's the foundation of Labour's entire doctrine, which is we just have to do it when the economic circumstances are right.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right that there might be a time where actually the defence circumstances outpace the economic circumstances, and then you get this debate. But I think, for where the Tories' defence spending was politically something that Tory members loved, a lot of the British public loved, it was a kind of easy win to do, to push up defence spending. Sunak wasn't going to have any rows with members over that. For Labour, it's not that there isn't support within the Labour ranks to increase defence spending. There is, but I would say there is also support for plenty of other spending pledges. So, the big row that's going to bubble up over the next couple of weeks is going to be the 2-child benefit cap and scrapping that and finding the money for that. There's also stuff like public sector pay and spending, HS2, government departments that need more money. So again, it just goes back to that thing of where will Labour find the money from to put the money into that? And no matter what they choose, there's going to be arguments about other things that need money. The risk factor is, as you say we have another huge international issue. So another kind of military incursion on a sort of epic scale, or a mass terror attack, or something that presents a clear, coordinated response from the UK government. And that gives the Conservatives a really easy attack line of why are you not pushing up defence spending? But I think, it is on Labour's list of things they want to put more money in, but again, they're just being super tight with, we need to grow the economy first. So you're right, it could be politically more difficult down the line, but I think it's in some way there's less push from inside the party to do that than there was for the Conservatives.
That we should be clear about the timeline here. I mean, Labour and the Conservatives has almost identical policies on this. They lifting it up to 2.5% of GDP at some point until April of this year, when Rishi Sunak plucked this 2030 deadline out of the air, and because essentially they wanted a confected dividing line with Labour for an election campaign. So still trying to press Labour to specify it will be by 2030 on some made-up fantasy fiscal projection that no one ever thought Jeremy Hunt could deliver, is just continuing the election campaign by other means. And I think Starmer's absolutely quite right to go, we're not playing that game anymore. We'll do it when we can afford it, and we intend to do it, as has always been the case, as Zoe said.
Zoe, things are so sort of dangerous out there that, honeymoon is not the word, but I was struck by something that Sinn Féin leader Mary Lou McDonald said, that the difference in dealing with Labour and the Tories was like daylight and dark. Now, considering the Tories actively damaged international relations with Brexit, also cuts to overseas aid, can Labour at least bank on some goodwill from people who are prepared to give it, just by not actively telling people to fuck off?
I think this is a really key point, and it's kind of the same situation with the unions. So we know Wes Streeting's in conversation now with the British Medical Association about ending the junior doctor strike. And I think it's quite likely that they do come to some agreement in the near future, because even just the way Labour interacts with the unions is just already sets the scene for negotiations in a far more positive light. People come to the table with an idea of what negotiations will look like, whereas previously the Conservatives wouldn't even, get round the table, and then they introduced all this anti-union legislation and just annoyed everyone. And I think there's a sort of similar thing going on with the EU, with the devolved nations, that the Conservative government were kind of openly hostile. It was part of their politics to the EU, to France. And, there was a lot of damage done to trust over the Northern Ireland backstop and things like that as well, which have had a corrosive effect on international relations. And I think you should give some credit to a new government coming in that has had time to build those relationships behind the scenes, set a kind of precedent for how they're going to speak to them and about them. That can be very, very helpful for diplomacy, because ultimately a lot of this is just about diplomacy. And, the UK's attitude during Brexit, or the UK government's attitude during Brexit, I think was quite destructive and put out a kind of image of how Britain regarded the rest of the world, which wasn't very helpful.
Well, we should wrap up. Considering he's in Washington D.C. and meeting President Biden, we should be talking about the absolute state of the Democratic Party over whether Biden should step down now that his age and mental acuity have become the biggest, almost only story of the election. Rafa, I found this was really harshing my mellow this past week because my feed was basically hooray for the election, and then the other half, or the American side, was like, oh Jesus wept. I mean, do you think there is point agitating to get Biden to step down? Which, I mean, I personally, I've changed my mind on it over the last couple of weeks. I feel like there is a certain inevitability to it, and better to do it sooner than later. But so many people aren't offering a really strong, clear alternative. And there's this idea that whoever, you could replace them with like a chair with Democrat written on it, and then that would beat Trump because Trump's so ghastly. I mean, do you think they're handling it well, or are they just freaking out?
Well, they're definitely not handling it well, because we're still having this conversation, and it was pretty clear, from within moments of that, fated presidential debate ending, that you really didn't want to run that guy as your candidate to try and beat Trump in a national election. And I think I'm in the same position as you, which is for a long time I thought that this is nonsense. This is confected chat to try and create some equivalence between Biden and Trump as some equally weak candidates, whereas one's essentially a horrible fascistic tyrant and the other one's a sensible president of the United States of America. It is clear now that it's so dangerous to run him as the candidate, because the reason, one of the strongest argument for not making Trump president again is it's a menace to the whole constitutional order of the US Republic. I mean, it's an existential threat. But putting someone in the White House who might be cognitively incapable of carrying out that job is also a threat. So it's so, I mean, maybe it's not equivalent, but it so debilitates the argument that Democrats want to make in the general election. So in terms of but should you be saying that if you don't have an alternative solution, could you just put a sort of a red rosette on a donkey, or blue actually in the American context, which is always slightly irritating, but you know what I mean? Democrats, donkey, make it. I know they are donkeys, so that kind of works. The analogy half works. Okay. But the point is, test it in a sort of a less high stakes environment. Like I remember when they were having this conversation in 2014, when it's like, maybe if we just got rid of Ed Miliband and put in like Alan Johnson, put almost anyone, actually we'd have a better chance of winning. And the answer probably then was, yes, you should actually do that. If everything is telling you the country will not make this person prime minister for whatever reason, then you don't owe them anything. It's bigger than that. Just make the right choice. And although obviously there's, Biden, American president against Trump, the stakes are that much higher. It's actually quite a familiar dilemma. And when it's definitely the wrong candidate, then find the right one and find a way to make it happen. Don't sit there cavilling about whether it's the wrong conversation to be having. That's my instinct anyway.
Sorry, some people seem absolutely convinced, and I mean, the polls are not great that Biden would definitely lose. But there's also quite a lot of attention on Project 2025, the extremely sinister ultra right wing plan for Trump Part 2. If Biden did run, do you think, it's all over? Do you think there is a chance, as people are reminded how awful Trump is? I'm just wondering, if do you have any optimism about the scenario?
I do agree with Raf that I think the best attack line the Democrats had was that Trump was unhinged and disturbed and would be a dangerous, unpredictable figure in the White House in a dangerous and unpredictable world. And therefore, you might not like Biden, but actually when you get to the ballot box, what do you think America's going to be safer with? And now when you have a candidate who genuinely seems unwell and impaired, that just throws that whole argument up in the air. And I think you're absolutely right. There are going to be a lot of American voters who hear about this Project 2025 thing, which basically involves sacking thousands of civil servants, expanding the powers of the president, dismantling the Department of Education, sweeping tax cuts. It's kind of extraordinary.
Well, camps for immigrants before they're deported.
Kind of horrendous, image, and that will put them off. But I do think where we are with Biden and people who could, the other line that he was a good president with a good track record, and that Trump is dangerous and unpredictable. All of that seems to just be diminished by all these conversations we're having about whether Biden can actually manage a second term. And I think I'm worried that just tips the balance way too much in the favour of Trump.
Well, just before we recorded, George Clooney said that Biden should step down. So it's all over.
So it's a done deal.
Let's have some questions from our Patreon backers in But Your Emails. If you support us, you too can submit a question to the panel. If we like it, we will try and answer it. First, it's a question from Mark Sellers. Often helped by the right-of-centre UK media, certain political folk myths have been widely aired about Labour, particularly the 1970s instability was all Labour's fault and Gordon Brown caused the 2008 financial crisis. Do you think the last 14 years of Tory chaos will be remembered as negatively as it should be, and will Brexit be remembered as a failed Tory project? I should say that one of those kind of former IEA pundits said, well, you can't blame Liz Truss now because she's lost her seat. It's everything that happens now is Labour's fault. And I was like, hang on 1 minute. Zoe, do you think that Labour should just be should just not let people forget?
Yeah. And I think it's going to be harder to forget because so much of what happened was so personality driven. There were people so clearly attached to the series of unfortunate events that occurred in the Conservative Party. So, you cannot talk about Boris Johnson without talking about Partygate and Chris Pincher and Owen Paterson. And I think Partygate is one of those things that's going to loom large in political history because it's like the perfect political scandal. It touches everybody in the country. It's corruption and lies, and it's just, it's an extraordinary political scandal. And, Liz Truss's mad mini budget, which was all over in a whirlwind, and then she only survived, I always forget how many days it was. 49 days in government. And then Sunak's just complete inability, nothingness, forgettableness, his inability to steer the ship. I just think so much of it comes down to who they were at their core as people. Whereas, you look at the sort of financial crash and Gordon Brown. I mean, I don't think people really attribute that to who Gordon Brown was as a person. They might look at sort of Labour's policies and they might talk about the economic climate and whether Labour handled it correctly, but I don't think it's so attached to our memories of that person. Whereas I think the Conservative Party over the last 14 years was so personality driven, it makes it kind of unforgettable.
Yeah, I think that's a very important distinction and speaks to this issue, which is actually some of the deep down toxicity of the Tory brand, which David Cameron famously made it his business to decontaminate and did up to a point, but amazingly still not enough that he didn't win a majority in 2010. He still had to rely on the Lib Dems to do some laundry of the Tory brand for a term. And so, if you think about something like that 2017 election, when Theresa May essentially sort of sabotaged her own campaign and Jeremy Corbyn did much better than people expected. But there were all sorts of things going on in that election. But one of them was clearly people didn't need that much reason not to vote Tory. And, I think you've seen the same thing this time around. So 2019 was an exceptional election for all kinds of reasons. But this time around, actually, there is deep in the British culture. I think there are an awful lot of people who more or less anyone under the age of 60, one of the few things they know about politics is they don't like the Tories. And the last 14 years will have drilled that in so hard, will have embedded that so deep in the sort of collective psyche of a large part of the British electorate. They are not bouncing back from what they've done anytime soon. And Labour will make it their mission to actually remind everyone. And the one caveat I'd add to that is I think Brexit is slightly different. So I think Zoe's right. Partygate, yes. Liz Truss, absolutely toxic for a long time. Bad smell, won't clear, no matter how wide you try and open the windows. Brexit, I think, has a more complex relationship with the British public and with British voters. And if the economy starts to really pick up and EU looks like a bit of a basket case in all sorts of ways, that narrative could take all kinds of different twists and turns.
Yeah, Brexit's back, baby.
The way I kind of like to think of it is, and maybe incorrectly, but how easily could you teach this to a class of A-level politics students? How much would they like to write about this particular incident in their essays? And something like Partygate or Liz Truss's mini budget. I remember this is the sort of thing you would, I can do a paragraph on that and a paragraph on that for the essay, what caused the Conservative Party to fall, and it's just almost like that easy, you can fold it all up and wrap it up in a bow.
Yeah.
Description. Whereas I think Raf's right that Brexit it feels more complex and it feels more like it was formed over a long period of time and it's still ongoing and it's thorny and knotty.
Well, hats off to Liz Truss for, after her defeat, trying to say, well, we never really had a chance to clear up the mess that Gordon Brown left. And the thing is with the whole, Gordon Brown financial crisis, of course, it's international. It starts in America. And you can say, well, there should have been more. He shouldn't have deregulated the city as much in the mortgage sector, and he's culpable. But also, him and Alistair Darling were kind of like world leaders in averting absolute catastrophe. So they actually did a thing. So it's quite complicated if you say Gordon Brown did this. So Gordon Brown also sort of helped repair this, or at least avoid the worst catastrophe. Obviously, the damage continued to this day. Whereas with Liz Truss, again, in your A-level history, A-level politics analysis, it's really, really simple. She came into the room, she set fire to it, and then she walked out. It's not complicated. It wasn't a world financial crisis. It was a homemade, localized crisis that she and her chancellor personally caused. So if I were her, I would probably have just said nothing, as she did on stage. I would have just run away.
I do remember looking back at the last time the New Labour government deployed the line, well, we were clearing up the mess that the Tories left in 1997, which is all about underinvestment, the state of public services. And it was in 2010. I mean, they were still saying that. They got a lot of mileage out of that, and in the same way that, I think the Tories have just about stopped trying to blame the sort of talk about the winter of discontent and, bin bags piling up in Leicester Square because of all the strikes in the late 1970s. But they were definitely saying that for a very, very long time, long after it had stopped.
My mum, who miraculously voted Labour this time, for the first time since 97, she still has bin bags in the street sort of vibes. And I was 4 or 5. It was like, you've got to let this go. But it's very scarring. And I think if the Tories think that some of the scarring caused by their tenure is just going to disappear from people's memories, I think they're in for a shock. Next up, last week was a whirlwind. Nobody could process everything that happened on election night. And there's been a deluge of data since then, which clarifies some of the things that went on. My favourite fun fact is the crossover age from voting Labour to voting Tory has shot up 20 years and is now 64. So the Beatles, When I'm 64, now describes the point at which you become a Tory. This is our last chance to revel in election good times, so we're going to discuss some trends that may have got overlooked. Warning, may contain stats. Zoe. So I asked Zoe and Raf to sort of pick what they most wanted to talk about. So you'll remember in the hours between the exit poll and actually results to talk about, the TV loved talking about reform. Predicted to get 13 seats, ended up with 5. And then somebody on Twitter pointed out pretty quickly, in 2015, UKIP got 12.6% and 3.9 million votes. This year, 14.3% with 4.1 million votes. So it's up, but has the radical right surge been overstated? Do you think it's still being overstated, or do you think that was almost like just some weird spasm in that kind of zone when there just wasn't much news?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the media continues to report on reform, and particularly Nigel Farage now he's in Parliament. I have a slightly optimistic theory that Nigel Farage, we may have seen peak Nigel Farage, because when you become an MP, you have to serve your constituency, and he may well choose.
Good luck, Clacton.
Yes, he may well choose not to be bogged down in all the things that Clacton are asking for. But then Clacton in 5 years' time will decide if they still want him as an MP. And we saw that George Galloway lost his seat almost as quickly as he gained it in last week. And he was a similar kind of that perceived anti-establishment figure, promising all sorts to Rochdale and then not coming through. So it'd be interesting to see how the media report on Nigel Farage particularly. But I found this statistic really interesting because there does seem to be a sense, or there was a sense, especially if you listen to right-wing media, which I try not to make a habit of, but sometimes I'm forced to, which is that, there really is this reform resurgence. People are, the silent majority are coming out all across the country, and finally they're voting for a party that's saying what they're thinking, and everyone's just getting more and more angry about immigration and more angry about net zero, and so they're choosing to vote for reform. But actually, when you look at those numbers, if anything, if you look since 2015, things have gotten materially worse. So wages have flatlined, we've got higher levels of inequality, public services have degraded, the economy has worsened, arguably Brexit in its current form has failed. We've also got an increase in social media use, more and more people on social media sharing ideas, the unlocking of COVID conspiracy theories. One of the reasons why this narrative has gone on is because in 2019, obviously Nigel Farage agreed not to contest 2019 Tory-held seats because Johnson was committed to a hard Brexit. So it looks like suddenly reforms come out of nowhere. Well, if anything, they were just, squished down voting for the Conservatives in 2019.
I suppose I wonder whether it just seems scarier now because with UKIP, it was all wrapped. They always thought the same things they think now, these people. But it was wrapped up in anti-EU. And now that that's gone, it's straight up anti-immigrant is in the front window. So they seem further right. They seem more overtly racist. But I don't know whether they've actually changed from 2015.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. They could frame everything as Brexit, and once Brexit was done, then, all our worries about our borders and all these EU regulations on net zero and things would be gone. And now that's, we've had Brexit and nothing's actually materially changed, the veneers come off and they can say what they want.
Raf, the left-wing argument about how you fight right-wing populism is essentially about delivering economically. They are the sort of the angry, economically left behind, and they've got these material concerns that are driving them to the far right. So it's that and competence. But you wrote a piece for The Guardian about Starmer's trip to Washington. And you point out that Biden's really measurable achievements, especially on the economy, haven't helped his approval ratings at all. So, I mean, is that a sort of problem that you can't just make people's lives better and then that spikes the guns of the radical right? If what they don't like is immigrants and net zero and people who are different.
Yeah, I think it's a big problem. I mean, certainly some people would say that in Biden's case, the issue is although the economy has sort of grown in a macro sense, people haven't felt it in their pockets. So you haven't actually delivered the material change. But this is a big question that I know has been discussed at the highest levels of the Labour Party, in Rachel Reeves' team, Keir Starmer's team. It's a conversation going on all the time, which is essentially, if you sort of unblock the sluices of wealth distribution, do you wash away the anger automatically that has made people want to vote for reform or vote for Brexit or vote for sort of radical populist far right propositions? Or actually, is that kind of economism, as they call it, kind of this a dry, desiccated, overly materialistic view of who people are, what actually animates voters? And you're kind of missing the point, which is actually a lot of people, what they're really upset about is not feeling respected by leaders and not having lost a sense of rootedness and connectedness and belonging in the political community. I mean, obviously, it's kind of both, right? Isn't it? These things that go along together. I do remember having a conversation. I was at some international wonkish seminar conference thing all about the rise of populism in the far right. And I was sitting next to someone who's an advisor to Angela Merkel. And everyone was talking about the left behind and this narrative of the economic victims of globalization. And she was just sort of muttered to me, it's like, you know what? We've got people with 2 Mercedes in the drive who are voting for AfD, right? Like, yes, the left behind thing is true, but also, and you could say the same thing about Brexit. There are an awful lot of very comfortably off, around where I live, rural Sussex, lots of people, red corduroy trousers, nice big cars, big detached houses, voting leave because they were angry. And the thing they were angry about was not the cost of living crisis. It was all bound up with a sense of identity and belonging. And there's a very good, in that article you mentioned, I referenced an article that was published in the American journal Democracy last year that I know lots of Labour people have been reading, called The Death of Deliverism. And this makes a really simple but important point, which is that, yes, it can be true that if neoliberalism, for want of a better word, fails and leaves people behind and they feel economically aggrieved and angry, and they turn that anger into a kind of a nationalist political expression, it's one of those kind of one-way chemical processes. I think it's called like sublimation in chemistry. You don't just reverse it by putting money in at the other end and spitting out a nice, happy liberal voter sort of back where you started. You need a whole other chemical process to try and you can't unscramble the eggs. And I think that's a real danger for Labour. Keir Starmer, his whole kind of I want to do my talking on the pitch, will just win by delivering and will persuade people by doing better government, is leaving a whole gap where the kind of emotional connection, storytelling, bringing people along with you needs to be. And he's just not good at that kind of politics.
Zoe, let's talk about Labour. They lost support among its base. It was really interesting that where it fell was in all the people that you would think were the core. It was like Remainers, graduates, young women. The biggest drop was in areas with high Muslim populations. Lewis Baston wrote a good piece saying that the equivalent of the entire national fall, 600,000 votes roughly, took place in the 64 most Muslim seats, even though Labour still won 57 of them. Now, do you think that this is primarily the Gaza factor, which means that when things move on, as they will eventually and hopefully soon, then you'll get what happened, say, after the Iraq War, when Muslim voters sort of returned to Labour after a few years? Or is there something bigger and deeper going on?
There are Muslim communities who definitely feel that they've been forgotten and neglected by Labour. And in some cases, that presents itself as Muslim voters who live in areas with Labour councils and who may be small business owners, or may just be, residents who see local failures as a result of a Labour council that doesn't care about them. So when I was in Rochdale for the George Galloway by-election in May, the thing that a lot of local residents were saying to me, and they if I asked them about Gaza, they said, yeah, of course we care about Gaza. But the main thing they wanted to talk about was the fact that the Labour council had installed cycle lanes, which meant that people could no longer park outside their businesses, which meant that they were losing business,
right.
Or that nobody was picking up their bins anymore, or there was just loads of rubbish and fly tipping. It was all kind of and they would all say it's the Labour council that are to blame for this. And I think there was also just a feeling that it's not only politicians that have forgotten about them and their local council that have forgotten about them, but even there, when the media were coming and they were descending on Rochdale to talk about George Galloway, I had a few people say to me, why do you only care about talking to us now? You only care when someone like George Galloway is talking to us and about us. So I think there's definitely a sense that they feel, some are angry with Labour councils, some feel like they've been forgotten by politicians. And because quite a lot of the time the politicians they interacted with were Labour because of Labour councils, they hold that at the door of Labour. I think there's also a frustration with how Islamophobia has been allowed to go unchecked in mainstream media for so long.
Yeah.
And they feel like they are, being demonized basically by politicians, and Labour hasn't done a good job at standing up for them. And I think that came to a head when Starmer made those comments about Bangladesh during the Sun hustings, where he said, at the moment, people coming from countries like Bangladesh are not being removed, despite the fact that Bangladesh isn't even in the top 10 for small boat arrivals. So I think there was a frustration, a feeling like quite often the Muslim community is thrown under the bus as well. And then Gaza was just the kind of tipping point of, this is where we would like the opposition, Labour, to stand up and speak for us, and they haven't.
Because, Labour was basically losing votes to the Greens, who did well with 4 seats, and independents. But what bothered me somewhat was some people on the left were speaking of the independents as if they were like natural allies. They were sort of basically Greens or socialists. And Jeremy Corbyn in the New Statesman, just for the election, listed people he was prepared to work with, which included George Galloway, obviously a non-issue now. And two of the candidates who almost beat Labour in Birmingham, Shabana Mahmood and Jess Phillips, made these appalling, like, misogynist, homophobic comments. One was from George Galloway's party. They do not seem like left-wing in any meaningful alliance-building way. They seem like deeply social conservative and super, like, aggressive. There are allegations of harassment or whatever. Is it sort of like, are we going to have to sort of see, actually, like, and these were two people who did not become MPs. Are we going to sort of dig a little bit deeper into sort of what this means, rather than thinking that everyone who wins from Labour in a Labour safe seat is somehow just more left-wing? Like, it's actually a much more complicated picture.
It is. It's much more complicated. You're completely right. I think partly because the Gaza issue has become quite so divisive and siloed, it's very easy for the media to say, people who are, very pro-Gaza are all of the left and people who are very pro-Israel are all of the right, when really it's a lot more nuanced than that. A lot of these independent candidates and the Greens and some of the left of Labour, they might be aligned on things like Gaza, standing up for minorities that have been disenfranchised and giving them a voice. But that's kind of often where it ends. And you look at the Workers' Party, so much of their policy was so incoherent. So they were actually quite critical of immigration. They were quite strong on immigration. They were anti-net zero, anti-LGBT sentiment that came out of some of their candidates.
They really had nothing to do, very little overlap with Corbyn there. So I was astonished why he was like, oh, I'll work with these people.
And everyone was saying, they're super left wing. And it's like, well, it kind of depends how you define left wing, because they're not super progressive.
Sometimes I wish that we could just be banned for just a period of time as an experiment from using the words left and right. And actually look at people's policies and their rhetoric. Because if you looked at George Galloway, so you knew nothing about him and he hadn't been labelled as left, you would not think he was left-wing. And it just feels like it just confuses people. Talking of people who you don't know whether they're left, right or centre, it's the Liberal Democrats. Raf, a lot was said about how kind of Labour's vote had not gone up that much. The Lib Dems, I think it's even more extreme, that Joe Swinson, 2019, complete disaster with 11.6% and 11 seats. Ed Davey, triumphant with 12.2%, actually dropped by around 200,000 because of lower turnout, ends up with 72 seats. Does that mean that their targeting strategy, their vote efficiency is like even better than Labour's? Is it this sort of achievement that's almost underrated in its precision?
Absolutely, I think it is. I mean, just in terms of, if the rules of the game are first past the post, and the Lib Dems have suffered so badly, from that and feel punished by it for so long, they have finally learnt to play the game, and they won 72-0 pretty much, because as you say, I mean, it's one of the most successful targeting operations in the history of UK general elections in terms of deciding where you want to win. And doing it. And what's very interesting about this is, I was having conversations with people, quite senior Lib Dems, a little while before the election was called, who were very worried about this. And they thought, it's so dismal to fight 40 or 50 by-elections, deliberately be a bit incoherent. We need to be representing something. We need to have some sort of value position that people can understand what Lib Dems are for. And they've gone very quiet now because it worked. And partly it worked because actually Ed Davey's attention-grabbing, weird falling off things into water-based campaign, coupled with actually a very effective message about him in his caring roles as a father and the son to his disabled son and to his parents, cut through to a lot of people as well. But no, I mean, it worked, and as a result, it's a great sort of achievement for the Lib Dems. That underlying question of, what are you actually for, and how will this new parliamentary presence be deployed, against or as sort of fellow travellers with Keir Starmer. I mean, ultimately, a lot of people who voted Lib Dem are, in the very, very loosest sense of the word, kind of Starmerite, in the sense that they were sort of throwing their lot in with a proposition which was get the Tories out, not massively into Keir Starmer, but perfectly happy for him to be the Prime Minister. And that is part of the mandate that the Labour leader is claiming.
And you also wanted to talk about Scotland, where the SNP had a bad night by any measure. It doesn't matter whether you're using raw votes, percentage, seats, bad. What interested you about that collapse, which I think would not have been predicted back in 2015, where this looked just like a sort of permanent hegemony? Not that anything is permanent now.
Yeah, certainly the scale of it, basically, is what surprised me. I mean, we'd known from the polling and from sort of the moods that gravity had finally come for the SNP, and they'd been incumbent for so long and had traded for so long on this quite clever thing that they can do, which is to say, the good stuff that works is because we're the government, we're representing Scotland, and the bad stuff that doesn't work and that we can't do is because the wicked Westminster English government is preventing an independent Scotland from doing what it should do. And because there was a combination of scandals and then 2 changes of leader and just general fatigue, plus the prospect of actually changing the government in Westminster by sending Labour MPs. All these things came together. And it isn't just that the SNP sort of machine just finally ran out of fuel, but actually the whole calculus of why you would vote for the SNP in the general election changed. And obviously, there are a lot of people who they used to be Tory voters in Scotland, and there still are. But again, they are very much in that category of people who would happily vote Labour, happy for Keir Starmer to be Prime Minister, partly because you've then got a unionist government as opposed to pro-independence government, and also by punishing incumbency.
I think underrated in the big sort of mandate discussion was the fact that so many people who were voting the Tories out knew that they were voting for a Labour government. So it's not just like the, whatever it was, 34% that wanted a Labour government. It's like you wouldn't be making those decisions and voting Lib Dem or voting Greenwald unless you knew what you were getting. Just to sort of wrap up big picture stuff. Here's another fun fact. Of the 38 red wall seats that Labour lost to the Tories in the last election, inspiring many, many books and documentaries, Labour won back 37. The only one they didn't win was Ashfield, which went to Lee Anderson, of course, who is now Reform. So the Tories ended up with none of them. So obviously, all these predictions about 2019 and the realignment, all this, turned out to be nonsense. And we're in a multipolar system now with this incredible volatility and almost like the death of the safe seat. So do you think it's harder for the parties, but do you think that's better for democracy? That what you're talking about, how a lot of Muslim voters felt taken for granted, just like Scottish voters in 2015 were feeling taken for granted, that it's just good that parties need to be on their toes and not banking certain voters.
I think to some extent it is good that there are seats that are these kind of bellwether seats that will really give an indication of whether a government has performed in the interest of a specific group. So quite clearly one of the reasons the red wall does sort of flip back and forth is because a lot of those seats feel the effects of austerity and deprivation very acutely. There's a lot of inequality there, a lot of social deprivation, and those voters vote accordingly when they feel like their interests haven't been taken into account and when they feel like they've been neglected by the government. The thing that makes it slightly more difficult and worrying is, I think, if you are a Labour government with a 10-year plan and you're hoping that things get better in 10 years and there is an election in 5 years' time, and you might be worried that the votes that you won, you could lose as quickly again if those voters don't feel like you've achieved enough in that 5 years. So, while it's good that it does mean that voters can hold the government to account, it is probably frustrating for governments like Starmer's government, which has a long-term plan, because they will have to deliver something to these people within 5 years.
Rishi Sunak said they didn't have a long-term plan.
I think so. He's absolutely right. This underlying volatility that means a massive Labour majority might be actually more brittle than it looks. But at the same time, for precisely the reason that you, Dorian, was saying, that actually there's a lot of people who voted Lib Dem who were basically Labour voters and vice versa because of what they were trying to achieve. That hasn't actually maxed out in terms of voter efficiency. So actually, because so many people thought Labour were going to win so big, people were quite casual with their Labour vote. And if in 5 years' time it feels a bit more credible that the Tories might be back, you might see an even more efficient use of that mechanism. And actually the sort of Labour, Lib Dem, Bit Green voter coalition that forms this huge blocking majority against the Tories could be, if not more effective, certainly equally effective in giving Starmer another term.
I just wanted to end with you, Raf, and a sort of a bit of history here, that there seems to be a lot of talk about analysing this and talking about this sort of sandcastle majority, your Yenga majority, which is my favourite one. And almost as if like you can look at this and therefore predict what would happen in 2028 or 29. But like, if you look at some of the biggest sort of percentage like majorities in terms of the percentage of the vote, Thatcher in 79, John Major in 1992, which is still, I think, the biggest raw vote in British history. Now, Major then lost to a Labour landslide. Thatcher, if not for the Falklands War, was in terrible trouble. It doesn't seem to... Do you think there really is any connection between how you won one election in terms of the popular vote and what happens next time?
I think it's a very Westminster-centric way of trying to analyse it, to say, well, 34% of the vote doesn't represent a sufficient sort of amount of victory. I think an awful lot of people... The problem is whether people don't actually rate Keir Starmer that much and are inclined to drift away from him. But that would be true, actually, if he'd got 40%, but people just wanted the Tories out. So the difference between 40 and 34 isn't actually a metric of very much. I think the bigger issue is actually whether Keir Starmer can turn the victory into something more like an emotional connection between him and the country, and he can genuinely look like he is speaking on behalf of the country that he wants to govern. So I'm not persuaded that the raw numbers make a big difference, but I do think that underlying volatility, basically every previous prime minister that you mentioned has also been able to rely on quite large geographic and demographic areas that just have such a baked in identity political vote. They just, round here we always vote Labour, or everyone in this town, it's just a Tory place. And from that, it then gets easier numerically and culturally to build out. And that, I think, has dissolved completely in British politics. So that underlying structural change is a problem for him. How you measure it in terms of percentages, I think it's like, most people intuitively, I think, out in the country think, well, if England win the Euros on penalties after a boring 0-0 draw against Spain, people will be a bit annoyed because it wasn't a great match, and they'll think, oh, it was a bit grubby. They're still going to think it's a win, isn't it? They're not going to say, well, we should probably give the trophy to Spain because, frankly, they kind of deserved it more. Nah, that's not how it works.
And that's the show. Thank you to Zoe Grünewald.
Thank you.
And Rafael Behr.
Thank you.
Stick around for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop, and a salute to our generous supporters who kept us going all the way through the election, the live cast, and now the Brave New World. Why not join them for as little as £3 a month and get the podcast early and without ads, plus lots more? Such Oh God, What Now Patreon to find out how. And we'll see you next time.
Hello, and welcome to the Brave New World from me to Rosalind Fennell, Uta 0761, Thomas Connolly, Sam Barker, Stu McFarlane, and Giles Cousin, I'm going to say, with a French accent, although that might not be how it's pronounced.
Big thanks and hello from me to Paul Sterland, Bethan Walton, Ivan Black, Zoe Thomas, Catherine Ives, and Jack Arnold.
And a mission-driven thank you from me to Tyrone Noble Hunter, Jason Pandia Wood, Mark Jenkins, Martin Leach, Amanda Goom, and the long-awaited return of Chris Wimlett.